And with that, the reason you're here, Dr. Kevin Anderson, father of the first family of learning, to talk about the new workplace performance through virtual and hybrid teams. Kevin.
Great. Thanks, Jay, so much for the introduction, and to Fredrickson for this invitation to present on my new book. We're going to do a deep dive today on really how to engage your teams in a deeper way in this virtual and hybrid environment. I think today is proving that virtual and hybrid is here to stay for those of us in the Twin Cities, really all through Minnesota, looking out the window at the storm here. So it works well being in a virtual setting. We've lived it the past couple years, and as Jay has referenced, really we're going to have this virtual and hybrid setting moving forward. So your comments at the beginning were very valuable, insightful about what should this look like. There should be connection, there should be collaboration, we should be doing trust building, we should really be bringing people together to solve the most critical organizational problems that we're facing. And today is going to be about diving into tools and techniques for doing that. And many of them are going to get at the comments that you threw out at the beginning that were very insightful. I want to start by thanking the leaders I've supported over the past couple of years who've really navigated this pandemic in a masterful way, and my peers, the organizational consulting peers who are on the front lines with me, really helping to figure out ways to work in this virtual and now hybrid environment. And I'm proud to say a number of them participated in the book and provided comments in the book as well. Want to thank as well, Jay, you mentioned them all the time, my awesome children, Maddie, Kenny, who's at Ecolab, and Zach, who does digital work with Fredrickson. Such an honor that they followed in my footsteps and are actually participating today. And shout out to my amazing daughter-in-law, Sophie, who's here as well. The final thing I want to say before we dive in to the objectives is how much fun this book was to write, because I was essentially capturing what I was experiencing in real time, going from living in an in-person world to a virtual world. And so it was really rewarding to be able to dive into that experience, and then as it was happening, capture it in book form with some lessons here. So we'll start, I'll tell you the story of my experience and my peers' experience, going virtual. We'll do a little QA, and then we'll break up into breakout groups and then hear from you, which is really, I think, the key to being successful in this hybrid world, is really to share our best practices. So let's go to the next slide, which is really where it all begins. So I received this text March 16th, 2020. Starting tomorrow, we work from home. This is how I start the book. I had no idea, like all of you on this session today, had no idea March 16th, how this pandemic would really rock our worlds in so many ways. I assumed that for a couple weeks, it would be a nice change of pace. I wouldn't be commuting across town, sit at home, get work done, drink coffee at home, and then in a couple of weeks I'd be back in person with my clients. So how different that reality was over the past couple of years, and how it required me and all of us to reimagine our work. That led to my quote the next day, which is the next quote I have in the book, which is, at home, staring at my computer, needing to design a virtual session. Is this the plot to a horror movie? No, it's my new reality. Not surprisingly, I did not take this very well, going virtually. Why? I had just spent decades really building my professional brand in the room with leaders, with intact teams, working with them to create organizational designs, strategies, shape new cultures. That was really where I spent my professional life. So when a younger colleague said to me in March of 2020, Kevin, what's the big deal? Just take what you do in the classroom and in the boardroom and conference room, and do that on the computer. There were several challenges with that. I've already mentioned I wasn't presenting like I am now to folks. Being an organizational development consultant, I was doing complex structures that would impact thousands of people in terms of how the company or organization is organized. I was working on change management issues where we're rolling out new products or processes, and we need to move hundreds, if not thousands of people in some cases to the future state. And then I was doing culture work, which is really very personal and requires getting into values, behaviors, assumptions, that kind of thing. So these were all things that I had done in person, and now to do those virtually created a really big challenge. The materials I had created over the past decades were all designed to be done in the room. So the comparison analogy I give is it would be like taking a Monopoly game and trying to play Monopoly with your family suddenly over Zoom. And we all experienced Zoom over the past 2 years. And at the beginning, trying to get family members not familiar with technology just to turn on their camera and unmute. So you can imagine carrying out these complex business processes virtually created a challenge. On top of it, I'm not a techie, to say the least. In my bio in the book, and for today, I describe myself as a self-described technological idiot. And
Let me go on speaker. How's that?
Pretty
you
good,
hear
I
me?
think. Yeah.
Okay, super. So where did we leave off?
It was perfect, Kevin. It was just as you were making your horror comment.
Okay. Where we ended up is, yes, I was a quote in the book that I was comparing my experience to being in a horror movie, sort of like technology, right? Losing technology, which we've just experienced. A challenge. So if we go to the next slide, and I'm not seeing the slides, but if you can just confirm, Mark, that we've moved on. The next slide is deep engagement with virtual and hybrid teams. So that's really what we're going to talk about today, is the kinds of comments that you made in chat at the beginning of the session of ways to problem solve essentially with your teams. And those can be organizational development kind of issues I mentioned, like doing org design or change management or developing strategies, but it really can be any sorts of organizational challenges you're facing. You're maybe putting a team of folks together and you need to know what kind of capabilities you need for folks on the team. You might be creating some learning and development content and know what sort of content to put in. Perhaps you're returning to the office and need to know what that looks like. So really the focus of this book and my comments today are around trying to find interactive technology and techniques that will really help you accomplish those goals in a virtual and hybrid setting. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with critical topics like instructional design, like solving day-to-day problems. We're going to pair those with online whiteboards and surveys, sorts of instructional technology, all in the name of getting, solving organizational issues. So Mark, if we go to the next slide, this is really where we begin with instructional design. And what I found is that the best way to resolve the kinds of challenges that I described is through designing and delivering differently. This wasn't hypothetical for me at the beginning of the pandemic. I had some big org designs scheduled. I was leading some change management projects, some culture work. So the first thing I needed to do is really actively engage the participants in learning and learners. And we know that's always been the case, but I think it's doubly important in the virtual world. Reed and Allen released a book at the same time as mine called Suddenly Virtual, where they cite teams perform up to 25% or more better when they're engaged. And we're all familiar with Katzenbach's famous book, Wisdom of Teams, where he talks about the need to take folks, individuals with multiple skills, experiences, judgments, and really put them into a powerful team and bring them together to solve organizational problems. And the key to that is to get your participants or learners to do something, to be active. The kind of medium we're on now, when you're virtual, lends itself to sort of this presentation mode. But the key is to get two-way dialogue to move people from passive to active mode, really by doing something and speaking up, robust discussion, and getting to the eventual solution. So the instructional design piece for doing that is really to take a look at what you're trying to accomplish and then identify the kinds of instructional techniques and tools we'll talk about next that really allow that kind of active participation, and what kind of facilitation, active facilitation you can do to make that happen. So the new instructional design formula that I discovered in the virtual world is really half the time, half the content, twice as much work for you, the person creating the learning or the experience. So I'll start with half the time. Before the pandemic, the typical thing we did would be to have the local leaders and team members come to the corporate headquarters and then, fly in the balance of folks. And that was really, that could look like a full week of everyone in person doing org design. What I found is in the virtual world, we had about half the time. If we were going to do a full day of a learning session or an organizational development session, now we had about a half day to do that. And that's because people, it's more difficult to focus online. They have a limited period of time. Similarly, I can only present about half the content because it's more difficult to follow content and have these in-depth discussions in a virtual setting. So I needed to simplify what I was presenting. For me, that led, in the book, I talk about twice as much work, but the reality is initially it was probably 10 times more work in terms of getting adept at using these virtual methods. So let's go to the next slide and really dive into some of these solutions having to do with pre-work and instructional technology and facilitation tips and tricks. So I spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about how to resolve day-to-day organizational problems. Those are things like you're having a problem with a product. One of your customers is unhappy. One of your technology systems is down. The reality is we spend most of our professional life in these day-to-day challenges that pop up when we get to the, they're not planned, they spontaneously pop up. And they, as I mentioned earlier, they really could be any sort of problem or opportunity having to do with teams or skills, workplace issues. So the key here is to have an approach to that, a problem-solving approach to put the team or the learner through. So I've taken Bloom's taxonomy and adapted it to be, first of all, definition. So we need to define the nature of the problem, really get people on the same page of understanding the challenge we're facing. Secondly is analysis. That's really the brainstorming part of this, where we're considering all the various options. And finally, decision making. This is where we're selecting, the best solution that's going to get us to the finish line. And you can see there the kinds of instructional technology tools I've relied on. For definition, include collaboration software. For analysis is online whiteboards, and decision making is polling tools. So let's first talk about the definition phase, and let's go to the next slide. So in terms of understanding the nature of the problem that's just popped up, problem with a product, you have an angry customer, or technology is not being rolled out as you planned. When we were in the office, that happened very spontaneously. We'd arrive to the office, get a cup of coffee, and there'd be the water cooler conversation, right? I saw Robin in the chat earlier mentioned recreating that water cooler conversation. And that's really what I discovered was the key to success here. Because in the virtual world, I found we would burn through the first couple meetings of people just defining the problem at hand, trying to get on the same page. And I needed to find a way to recreate those water cooler or hallway conversations online. And so that's the image you're seeing here. This is all in the book, and what we'll see today is mocked up data, but it really teaches the concepts of the value of these tools. So in this case, we have an SAP team. They're rolling out some accounting software, and it's not going well. And so what I asked the team members to do is, before the first meeting, to post their ideas on collaboration software. We use Microsoft Teams in our case, but there's lots of collaboration softwares out there. And the value of doing this is then it recreates those water cooler conversations. So before arriving at the first meeting, people have thought about, is the problem having to do with coding or testing? Is it a quality control problem? Is it a data security issue? And this is so important because remember, we only have about half the time for virtual meetings than we did in person. So having people arrive at the first meeting, having thought through what some of the solutions could be, is really helpful. So if we go to the next slide, this is the next phase here of analysis. This is where we're really brainstorming. So when we were in person, that happened again pretty easily. We have folks in the room. We would start throwing out ideas of possible solutions. We'd have flip charts. We'd have Post-it notes. What I found is in the virtual environment, it was at times difficult to follow along for folks. Sometimes we only heard from one or two members of a team. Other folks were silent, and none of it was being documented. So we might have a robust discussion of some great ideas, but then it was difficult to move to the next step because we didn't have it documented in sort of an organized way. So the solution in this case, from an instructional technology point of view, is using online whiteboards. Again, there's many whiteboards that are out there. I use Mural. You can go to mural.com and get a free 7-day trial, as you can with all these tools. This is essentially an online whiteboard. So with our technology example group here rolling out SAP, where you see the Post-its there, that starts out blank. The participants can grab a Post-it and type their ideas to solve the problem. The first group I worked with was not very sophisticated technologically, so I volunteered to create the Post-its for them. And they were telling me what their ideas were. I was typing the ideas, and all of a sudden a Post-it popped up, and one of the participant leaders realized she could create a Post-it, and then all the leaders jumped in and were brainstorming and creating Post-its. One of those silver lining moments where this instructional technology was actually better than being in person, and it was a really dynamic way to have a really robust brainstorming session. And then the final step here is decision making. This is where we're considering all the various solutions, and we need to select the best solution to move forward with. Again, when we were in person, I would have folks give thumbs up. I was known to go around the room one by one and have each leader weigh in. What I found difficult online was, again, sometimes people weren't speaking up. Sometimes the leader would give their solution and other folks would just agree. and sometimes the loudest person in the virtual room ended up selecting the solution. So here we went with an online polling solution. We use menti.com, and again, there's dozens of online survey and polling tools. The great thing about Menti, it's in real time. Many of you have used it. So you see here in the example, I asked the technology team to rank the solutions, 1 being the most effective solution, 6 being the least effective. You immediately hear from everyone. Everyone weighs in. So back to your comments at the beginning of, getting the consensus collaboration, hearing from everyone in the room. This is a very small d democratic type tool where everyone gets to weigh in. It's easy to save and send, and then it can lead to a more in-depth discussion. So that's how I use these tools, for sort of day-to-day business problems that popped up. Other topics I go in depth in the book. For example, developing strategy and moving from strategy to execution. Did a lot of work leveraging these kinds of tools as well, online polling, online whiteboards, to be able to have in-depth discussions with leaders and intact teams about the strategy. With organizational design, there's a lot of moving pieces. Ended up using Excel as we created roles, and I needed the design team to weigh in on how much time on task these roles were going to spend. The numerical nature of Excel worked well. And finally, I did some culture work, and that really requires people to open up and talk honestly about the culture we have today versus the aspired to culture. So I had all sorts of facilitation tricks. I would join meetings early, have my camera on, really encourage folks to have cameras on in order to get to know each other more. I often called out participants by name to really get people more active, and really use a lot of these facilitation tricks and tips to try to recreate that in-person kind of environment in the virtual. I saw that was a comment at the beginning of today as well. For your criteria of success virtually is to have the same kind of feeling as you're in the room virtually, and that was definitely the case for doing the culture work. So I think in conclusion to this section, I found that many of these virtual tools were highly effective. Some of you know Cassie Labori, who has spoken at a number of L&D conferences. She released a book at the same time as mine called Producing Virtual Training, and she describes it as a great companion to my book, because my book talks about how to facilitate these tools, and she really describes in depth how to use these tools from a technology standpoint. So found her book really helpful as well. So Mark, let's go to the last section here, which is really where we're at today, which is the future, which is hybrid delivery. So this is what we're finding today in our workplaces. Some folks have remained virtual, and others have returned to the office. So you could argue this is even more challenging in that it was easier, you could argue, to either have everyone in the room or everyone virtual. Now you have a mix. Some people are in person and some people are online. So the first thing we found here that's really effective is to go with these virtual tools. So for the people in the room, have them bring their laptops and continue, as you've done the past couple of years, to use the virtual whiteboards, the virtual polling, because it really creates an equivalent experience for everyone. Truth be told, before the pandemic, when I was in person, I played more to the room. So my methods really worked well. If you're sitting in the room with me, there was always a few people on the phone. It was kind of up to them to follow along. And the expectations have really changed for the better, where now the expectation is whether you're in person or virtual, you should be able to participate equally. As I mentioned, it's a more democratic process where everyone's fully engaged. And the other piece of that is I think it requires even more active facilitation than we had in the past. being even more engaged as a facilitator, lots of meeting assignments, cameras on, calling out people by name, changing up the energy of meetings frequently. I've been known to end meetings halfway through if people aren't engaged and say, let's just regroup next week. It kind of shocks people, but sometimes it helps set these expectations that you as the facilitator and the designer of a session are really going to make sure that there's full engagement. And then lastly, and I think most importantly, we have an opportunity in this hybrid world to really invent even better ways of working. So we have this new talent landscape where many of us have these virtual and hybrid capabilities. There's more attention on hybrid. LinkedIn announced last week that 60% increase in jobs out there with the words hybrid and virtual work in the titles. The rules of engagement have changed. Many of our stakeholders' expectations have changed over the past couple of years for the better. So there's a real opportunity for us to, step up and create a work environment where, regardless of where you are, you can fully participate. No RSVP needed anymore. You decide, given the nature of the work, where you're going to dial in from. So let's, Mark, head to the last slide, wrap it up here. On a positive note, so this is the last slide I put in the book, which is the pandemic was beyond horrible in so many ways for so many. However, a highlight was working virtually. It wasn't the horror show that I anticipated a year ago. I mean, as you've heard, it was perhaps a drama. It was a little bit of a comedy at times, but I think the message here is that these online tools really worked well. In some cases, to my surprise, they actually led to better outcomes than the in-person approaches I was using. And now I think the challenge is for us to invent even new and better ways of working in this hybrid world and doubling down on these virtual and hybrid tools. So thanks for listening to my journey here. And I think the best way to really get better at using these hybrid tools and functioning really at our best for our teams is really to share our best practices. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jay to get us in some breakout rooms so we can share our experiences.
Okay, so in the spirit of today's session, one of the things that we've talked about is the idea that, both virtual and hybrid presentations, you've got to try some new things because if you don't, every presentation is the same. And so today what we're going to try to do is we're going to go back and forth between people asking Kevin questions and then people being able to volunteer to share kind of something from their breakout room that they found particularly helpful or useful, kind of their aha of their breakout in terms of a report back. So if she is willing, I am going to ask Malia to ask Kevin the first question. Malia, if that's okay, would you come off of mute and ask Kevin the first question?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Jay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So I work with post-consumer brands. I'm part of their HR talent acquisition, org effectiveness team. And so just given that context in working in the corporate environment, one of the most, I'd say, significant challenges we've had come up since moving to the hybrid model is just an overwhelming sense that we've lost a really important part of our culture. Probably like most employers going through everything that we have in the past year and a half, 2 years. And so we're sort of going through the process of redefining, what does effective culture look like now that we've committed to this hybrid model and future state. And so my question is, we're really struggling to, I think, embrace a culture of hybrid where I think we're indexing a little too far on the side of, when we all come back in the office, that's when we create culture. That's when we build in team engagement. That's when we do, those more connected team meetings and conversations versus pulling some of the tools that we've talked about already. I know in the breakouts, we talked about some tools as well and pulling that into just that cultivating of culture. So I'd be curious to know kind of what your recommendations are as far as how to embrace a culture of that hybrid model and then leverage the tools that are most important for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And in the book, in the chapter on culture, I talk about when I was a independent consultant at a boutique firm for a couple of years, flying around to sites. I was doing some culture work, and the leadership team was giving a presentation about, what an amazing culture it was, and people were so engaged and were there 24/7 having fun together. And I went to get a cup of coffee and noticed they had a pool table, and then as I looked, there weren't any pool balls on the table. There's no cue even. So I asked, one of the administrative assistants what the deal was, and she was like, "No one ever plays pool here. We don't even have the equipment." So the point being, when you're doing culture work, pre-pandemic, when it was in person, I think it was easier to see those cues. You'd be there in person and you would pick that up. The reality is, and you point this out, now culture is hybrid, right? It is online, and part of it is in the office. So I think the key is to really find ways to get people to open up honestly about what the culture is. And because part of the culture is being virtual and hybrid, just diving into those environments and then encouraging cameras on and finding, ways to get people to really, speak from the heart about what's really going on in terms of values, assumptions, beliefs, the way it is today versus your aspired to culture. And I think we're all figuring that out in real time. That's a new thing. So I'd be interested, things you've tried and others have tried to dive into culture.
This is
Anyone?
Denise. I can share
Perfect,
something.
Denise.
Great.
Yeah. So my name is Denise. I'm a director of a healthcare middle revenue cycle at a healthcare system in Minneapolis, Hennepin Healthcare. And so it's been an interesting couple of years. So I support a large couple teams of all the coders, the medical coders. And so historically, they actually have been remote. So probably for 5 or 6 years now, most of the coding teams have been remote. So we had kind of a leg up in some situations, but then we have some people who are used to being on site just like everyone else. So we're really living in this hybrid space right now. And I think some of the key pieces for me and my team, at least, is really focusing on the fact that virtual is the next normal, right? It's not really new necessarily. It's been there. We haven't been utilizing it as much, but it's the future. It's where we're at now. It'll probably change again eventually. And so I really focus, especially with my leadership teams, on setting those expectations. And when it comes to culture, it might sound kind of silly, but we say the mission every morning, the mission of our organization. We say it, we rotate saying it. It's not like we need to hear it because we forget it. It's just, there's little things like that we keep in practice. So we say the mission, we stop to talk about it. What does it mean to you today? How are you, going to fulfill the mission? Or maybe it's a business strategy, or and then I think it's also just communication and connection are huge. So how do you have to give people time. People want your time. They need your time. If they're not seeing you in the coffee room anymore in the break room. They have to see you in another way or hear from you in another way. So another key piece that we do, and it's an expectation that I set for all of my leaders, supervisors and managers, is when they do one-on-ones, which are required, that they write down personal information about each of their employees. So they just put it at the top. Some of my supervisors have 30 team members that they have to round on once a month. So it's a lot of people to remember. So they just write little notes and they'll say, okay, I'm having a one-on-one today with Sally. Her daughter's name is Jane. She's in college, like little things just to have that personal connection. It just helps. It really helps from my perspective and my experience. That's just one little tip, I guess, in relation to culture.
Denise,
So,
that's-
yeah,
oh,
so
go ahead,
great.
Kevin.
Well, yeah, I was going to just jump in to say, so great, Denise, those practical kind of ways to connect back to the mission statement. And I saw the comments coming up, people really having, resonating with that, connecting to those day-to-day culture things. And we've found it's important in some cases. Somebody mentioned icebreakers, doing icebreakers. Important, and we found it can be useful to update your exercises or your icebreakers to meet where people are at today. So pre-pandemic, we sometimes ask people, what's your favorite ice cream? That feels pretty trite when you're coming back from a pandemic. So we've been doing an icebreaker where we have people reflect on what are the values that got them through the past few years and what are those values they want to double down on to moving forward. And it just it being respectful and meeting where people are today and really diving into these deep kind of culture questions, which your comments reflected, which I think are great.
Okay, I have another question queued up, but Zach said he had one that related to this. And since he is part of the first family of learning, I guess I can let Zach ask his question.
I get priority. Oh gosh. Well, my question kind of relates to that in the whole regards to, some people were already used to virtual and others aren't before the pandemic. So my question is, do you think your book is relevant for younger generations who've been online for their whole lives and don't really know a world before virtual?
Zach, I think you've been waiting your whole life to ask me a tough question like that publicly to put me on the spot here. Thank you. That's a great question. Chuck Klosterman, I'm reading his latest book called The 90s. He's a great rock critic, but social critic. And he talks about in that book that there's really only two generations that experienced internet and post-internet at the same time, pre-internet and having the internet, and that's baby boomers and Generation Xers. So what I think it's not surprising that a baby boomer, in my case, Generation Xer, would write this book because, as you heard from my presentation, it's so interesting to me, having lived, and those of us who lived in both those worlds, to reflect on it. At the same time, what I find with my colleagues is that folks who've always lived in a virtual world sometimes take for granted that these tools exist and that we are virtual. And I've gotten feedback from these younger colleagues that it's helpful to take a step back and do the kind of instructional design I talk about and real proactive work to figure out what are those tools that are out there that are really going to help us have the deeper conversations. I had a colleague, and she's about your age, Zach, who when I was creating the book said to me, Kevin, I don't get it. It's like I've always had the internet. And I actually had her write the reaction to the final chapter about that. She was a little nervous to do that because she was kind of saying, what's the big deal? But at the same time, she recognized that it can be really valuable for people who've lived with the internet their whole lives and live virtually to take that time to really do a deep dive and figure out how to use these tools in an effective way. Interested what people think, though. Some of you might say, like Zach, I don't get it. Why write a book about this?
So Zach gets a timeout when he gets home tonight.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, Sheila, Sheila Hines Edmondson, if you'd ask Kevin the next question, please.
Sure. Kevin, this question is a bit of a two-part question. So I'm thinking about how much distraction that we've come through or we've overcome and are working through now. And then I think when the pandemic becomes endemic and there is a more, I'll say, a normalizing, what are your thoughts about how to allow people to have a period of recovery while still working toward high performance? And then the second part of the question is, what are the next wicked problems that are facing organizations that are begging for a solution that we should be thinking about based on your research?
Wow. Yeah, great questions. So that having a time sort of to recover, your first question, did I hear that correct?
Yes.
Space for people to recover from what we've been through. I mean, how I've experienced that in my organization is just leaders doing a really good job of paying attention to that and, you know, proactively offering that up to teams and employees that, you know, there's sometimes you really do need, you may need to take a break, right? To recover, so to speak, and get back on your feet. So I think true of any time to be aware of that. I think part of what's simplifying and helping me navigate this hybrid world, and I think a lot of us, is once you have the mindset of living in a hybrid world, a lot of the logistical problems go away. Things that I think a lot of us are worrying about during the past year about, are we going to be in the office? Are we going to be virtual? Some combination, how is that going to work? Once you've committed to virtual and your learning programs, your sessions, your interactions are hybrid, I mentioned, depending on the work you're doing, depending on the logistics, people can decide they're going to be in the office or they're going to be virtual. We had a meeting last week where somebody said, this is great, this is hybrid, because walking out the door, my kid threw up. And here I am at home participating. So, I mean, I mentioned in the book, no RSVP needed. That helps simplify, I think, our world moving forward. I see some chats already about your other great question of, you know, what are some of the wicked problems coming up that we need to dive into. You know, I'll throw out one and then really want to hear from folks. You know, where we're at with that. For me, a lot of, as organizations, what we're figuring out is how to balance, you know, some of the things we've had in the past with some of the new kinds of cultural things happening and where we're at. So, you know, in the past, some of our practices led to real, you know, important interactions with customers and close relationships with customers. And some of that was flying to customers, right, and being in person. And now in the hybrid world, maybe some of that is more online or hybrid kind of experiences. So I think for me, it's a lot about figuring out, taking the best of some of the past practices that worked well, and then infusing in some of these newer technologies, instructional technologies, to get to a better solution. Other folks' thoughts on that? That's a great question.
Hey, Kevin, Lynn Kissick's been waiting for a while, so
Yeah,
let's let her get in with her question and comment. Lynn's
Thanks.
still there?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Sorry, I had to get my mouse over to mute. How many times do we hear that on conference calls now? Hang on, I had to get to mute. A couple of comments and question just in reaction to the gal who talked about stating the mission and vision at the beginning of each of their meetings. I start our team, or I have our team meetings started with a culture moment. And it is a moment where our organization has culture training, which we haven't had for 2 years. So all of my new hires are going, what? But our culture practices, and we just take a theme and I ask them to put their own spin on it and to share it out at the beginning of the meeting. So we rotate through a different team member providing that at the beginning of a meeting. And then we take that culture moment and apply it to the rest of the conversations that we're having. So we may have a conversation about, how is our upgrade coming, and somehow tie it back to the culture moment that would have been mentioned. And thinking to the generational question that that your son asked, I find that it is interesting that not all people in that generation are as comfortable with tech and as comfortable with being completely virtual. So there does still need to be some care and feeding of our audiences, which ties to the conversation that we had in the back in our breakout session, which was around that need to train folks on the technology prior to having that technology being used in the, for us, classroom, that we've in some cases needed to build in a half hour. Here's how you use WebEx training. Here's how to raise your hand. Here's how to start a chat. So it's interesting, those different adaptations that we've made, both from a culture perspective and from a generational and learning perspective, as we've transitioned fully to virtual in some cases, and for our meetings, hopefully transitioning back in person at some point.
Great point. Yeah, things like especially like the virtual whiteboard. I had colleagues who offered multiple trainings for those of us who are designing using virtual whiteboards and facilitating. Because I think, to your point, Lynn, there's a lot of things to learn, right, about navigating those kind of technologies successfully. So great point about that, and that not making overly generalizing certain generations better at tech or not about tech. And it sounds like you're pulling in folks. You've embraced that hybrid kind of philosophy in that, from what you said, Lynn, it sounds like you're pulling in folks who might need some additional training or in-person kinds of experiences where it makes sense, right? Not just for the sake of being in person, but where there's an organizational reason for it.
Hey, Kevin, I'm going to cut in here with a comment, and then I want to ask Anita to ask her question versus me reading it, because I think it's a great one, and I think it will build on one of the things that I want to share about, kind of all of this, in terms of virtual and hybrid and what's next, and even the generation things. Samuel Ragsdale, who's the CLO at 3M, always told me that he has a global team. And if his meeting is global, which means everyone can't be in person, then he does it all virtual, because he wants the experience to be the same for everyone. And so it will be interesting to see, kind of as we go back to a hybrid type of world, what happens. And I think that's a great lead in, Anita, to your question, if you'd be willing to come off mute and ask it to Kevin.
Yeah, and I'm looking in chat and I'm seeing some really great suggestions in there and thoughts. So Kevin, it's just this whole idea of culture and those people who choose to stay remote and those that go back into the office. Is there going to be kind of an inequity or feeling of a leg up if you go back into the office and your commitment to work as opposed to if you stay remote, and how do we navigate that? And I think some people have some really good comments already in chat.
Yeah, great question, Nita. And I saw some of the comments as well. I mean, I just think that is a really valuable thing to think about. And I think it goes back to the challenge that I gave as part of this presentation for us as, you know, organizational development consultants, L&D professionals, to step up and really help create this hybrid environment where everyone has the ability to show up equally. You know, pre-pandemic, for some organizations, showing up might meant literally being in the room, but in the hybrid world, we all know there's ways to show up virtually that can be just as effective or more effective than being in the room, right? There's opportunity in all these spaces to show up. And I think as folks creating these environments, you know, I mentioned pre-pandemic, I would play to the room. So I would have almost everybody in the room with me. Few folks, for whatever reason, were on the phone, and it was up to them to show up or try to keep up. And my approach now in this hybrid world is very different in terms of creating ways to equally, so people can be equally engaged regardless of where they're at. So Ragsdale's comment is interesting to me. I've heard a number of my peers suggest that. I'm going down a different path with that, because I think there's value for people who can and want to be in person at times. So if we can create this hybrid world where people can be in all sorts of environments, then we don't need to put any rules beyond it than that, right? You show up where you're able to, and let's create an environment where everyone can equally participate.
One other thing I just wanted to ask, because I think it might have been Molly who brought this up. One thing that really strikes me about all of this, and we've all struggled with the accessibility, the ADA compliance. One of the things with things that we're trying to do in our courses this is kind of brought home to me how people who don't have, or either sight impaired or hearing impaired, and we always know we need to do this, but kind of now we know what it feels like in some ways. I think it's been really interesting. I don't know if anyone else has had that experience.
So you're speaking of inclusion specifically, Anita?
Yep, inclusion and creating experiences that are inclusive, just as Kevin just said, but in our learning or in our training and how we do that. It's just kind of drives home the point to me, what it's like to feel sometimes left out. So,
well, I think what's interesting in the whole conversation as I hear everyone's dialogue is that intentionality comes to mind. And Kevin, you mentioned it when it came to instructional design, for example, using these tools intentionally, consciously, competently, and not just throwing things in the mix because we can. And Anita, I think that speaks to your issue too. Know your audience, and to be very intentional so that it's facilitative and not something that's going to alienate people, even generationally. Getting lots of folks on board who say, no, you have to use 6 more tools to be in my training department. Well, I don't want to, so I'm going to opt out. Thank you very much. You know, so that consciousness, conscious effort, and intentionality, I think, is what I'm hearing as a major thesis through your conversation, Kevin.
Yeah, I just see a comment there from Greg about building that into instructional design, right? To your point.
Absolutely.
Rich. Yeah, really important.
I think we have time for one last question. Anyone want to volunteer to ask the one last question for Kevin?
Well, I already got the toughest question for my son, so
yeah,
we've gotten through that. So
I was thinking we should have Maddie ask you a question. But
she'd be even tougher, probably.
No, I'll remain the favorite and not ask a question.
Okay.
The favorite. I love it.
Smart.
Okay. Any final questions for Kevin?
This is Loretta. I have a question. We talked about it a little bit in our group, but this piece about when you're actually physically meeting together or trying to do a training, and you've got some people in the office and some people at home, and to have that inclusivity, it feels like we haven't yet figured out an option outside of essentially just designing it as if everyone remote. And I'm wondering if there are other options that people have had that actually effectively work that hybrid component of right now you're hybrid. You've got some people in the office and some people that are remote. That's
Yeah, great. Anyone want to jump in on that? Anyone's had experience with?
$1 million question.
Yeah, yeah.
I actually think, we were talking about intentionality, and, so think of like what we're doing right now. So some of it's intentionality, but some of it is also the marketing and the expectation setting. So you can't make, at least, unless you have multi-million-dollar tools, I suppose, the hybrid experience that's exactly the same for people. But doing breakout sessions and making sure that you're letting people remote present back as well as people in the room, knowing, what your equipment is, so can people see the people in the room or can they not, and just, adding an instructional design component to where you can try to facilitate both more effectively. But I'll also just say the idea of not forgetting what the virtual and hybrid allows, which is you can be multiple places. 60 Minutes a month ago said 1 in 7 jobs is remote right now.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And so we're going to have to get better at doing it. But part of it is also kind of the idea of that, hey, remote and virtual and hybrid and in person all offer some different things, and that we're going to have to get comfortable with that. It might not be the same for everyone all the time.
Yeah, and Jay, another point to that is that I think as learning leaders, we have to really be intentional about asking our clients what they doing that analysis in our assessments. We're going to lose big market share. We have to involve them in the solution.
Yeah, and getting that, to your point, Rich, I think getting that feedback from folks is so critical. And I know one of the things I heard back from my clients is those kinds of instructional technology tools we looked at today, they really enjoyed and benefited from in the virtual world, and were really clear to keep using those in hybrid. And I think that $1 million question of how you involve everyone, so far what's working well for me is doing the online polling, doing the whiteboard where you have half the people in the room and half the people are remote, but everyone is represented, right? So when it comes to selecting the solution, you've just done a ranking and every single person participated as weighed in. And then you can have a robust discussion about that with everyone represented, and then some good facilitation, right, of making sure you pull people in who are remote, as well as paying attention to people in the room. So far, that's the thing that's worked the best for me.
I have one really quick additional comment to that. Just the other, it kind of seems, again, sort of elementary or like assumed that we put meeting agendas together, that we put a detailed description of what the meeting's about. Those little things, though, they often get missed, and we don't, at least in our organization, we don't see that kind of standard organizational tools being used. So I think that's another tip. So, I mean, if you can be in a meeting that's virtual, that's being run well, it makes all the difference. So having an agenda, having a facilitator called out, leaving time at the end for questions. So, creating a template like that is also really helpful.
Well, that's a great point. Boy, I want to thank everyone. It's funny, when we were prepping for this session, I told Kevin that I thought this was not only timely, it was timeless. And I think the discussion today will show just how important this is. And so we really do want to pull out that we are going to be sending a survey to get your feedback on today's event. And we want to thank Kevin for his time and for sharing his knowledge with us, and just a great session. And please complete the event survey. And as a thank you, you will get a copy of Kevin's book. And I bet pretty much everyone will fill out that survey, Kevin, to get this book. So with that,
Thanks.
we've got just chat is blowing up with thank yous, but let's continue to chat the thank yous for Kevin, or if people want to come off mute and say thank you, or if they want to do the clapping hands, we'll take any and all. And so again, thank you, Kevin, so much for today's
Thank you,
session.
Kevin.
Excellent. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.